When a new company moves to a small town, they find office space difficult to find. Fortunately, an old church is available and soon becomes their new headquarters. But as we learn from author Cam Smith, the church's history quickly becomes a problem for the person in charge, especially when he discovers secrets hidden in the church's basement. Narrator Mike Delgadio reads the tale for us, and it's certainly no fairy tale, even with the church's Grimm.
I have some strong words for whoever had the idea to set up our business at an old church. There was no denying it was inexpensive, and it's also true that there was no contest for tenancy. The church was the only available property in this northern Ontario township. I was amazed we found it at such a fair price. Being the only investment firm in town would surely have its benefits. I was eager to start advertising the business, but first I felt I had earned myself a drink. Surely such a small and desolate town had a pub where one could pass the time. After a short search, I found what I was looking for. On the corner lot at the very edge of town, I found the Mutt's Tail. From the outside, it looked to be empty, with a dim orange light shining through the windows. Upon going inside, I found an entirely different scene. The place was lively and warm. Everyone there seemed to be having a good time. I hung my coat on the rack with the others, my black trench coat looking out of place when compared to the gray farm coats. I sat in front of the bar, and almost immediately 2 younger men sat on either side of me. They introduced themselves as handymen of sorts who had grown up in town. The bartender came over to take my order and poured me a stout without delay. As I spoke to the gentleman at my sides, I drank eagerly from my glass. The drink was cold and tasted like nothing I had had previously. My companions explained that it was brewed right there in the pub. As the conversation progressed, the topic turned to business. I explained that I had come to town to start an investment firm for the mines in the surrounding area, and that I would be setting up in the old church. As soon as the words had left my mouth, the room was silent, and all eyes were on me. The boys on my side quickly told everyone that I had a bit too much to drink and they'd take care of me. Before I knew what was going on, I was hoisted to my feet and taken outside. My new friends explained their actions to me just outside the pub. The church which stood there today is not the original church built on that spot when the town was founded. It was instead a replica, built some time after a devastating fire burned the original to the ground. To me, this seemed like no good reason for their actions, but they continued their story. Apparently, the fire had started when the preacher, who resided there, had attempted something he never should have. I inquired as to what that was, but they said it would be irresponsible to speak of it. They only told me that it was cursed, and if I ever heard a dog within its walls, I should leave immediately. I was confused by their cryptic message, but I thought it was a joke one would play on the newest resident. Well, I said goodnight and made my way back to the church where I would sleep. I planned to call my partner the next day and tell him to make preparations to join me. That evening, I found myself unable to sleep. The words of the young men had disturbed me in a way that I wasn't afraid, but I was cautious. I chose instead to do the paperwork regarding the lease and the management. Around 11, I heard a crowd in the general direction of the pub. I guess it had just closed up for the night. Twice that evening, as I sat at the desk, I thought I heard the sound of something scratching at the great oak doors. Once, I was convinced I heard the clicking of claws walking down the aisle towards the altar. From the window of my office above the altar, I could see nothing and decided that my mind was playing tricks on me. I finished my work and moved to the cot I had set up in the same room. I tried desperately to fall asleep, but it never came to me. I couldn't bring myself to turn down the light. When the morning light broke through the stained glass, I made my way downstairs to go outside. When I opened the great oak doors, I saw a crowd gathered before me. None of them looked at me. They all had their attention focused on the doors themselves. Among them were the two men from the night before, and they did meet my gaze. I stood beside them and looked at the doors. Immediately, I saw long gashes in the dark brown staining of the doors, revealing the lighter wood beneath. My friends asked me a question I knew was coming. Had I heard anything? I told them I did, but it was just something at the door, and I hadn't opened it. I also mentioned the sounds from the aisle. A look of sheer horror came over them, and they told me that I was not safe in the church any longer. There was much confusion, but among the townsfolk I heard talk of monstrous wolves and invisible hunting hounds. I asked the two men if there was further information I could find. They told me that since it was too late for them to withhold information, for my safety they would tell me everything, and then they told me to follow them to the town hall where the records are housed. The three of us came to a door labeled History, and the taller man, who called himself James, opened it. The second man, a shorter but more muscular fellow called Sam, then ushered me inside. They sat me at a table with a desk lamp and told me to read everything they brought to me. I watched them walk to the farthest corner of the room and open a dusty filing cabinet. James retrieved a folder brimming with official documents and newspaper clippings alike. Sam took out a photo album and dropped it on the table in front of me. I opened the file and was met with an article from a newspaper which was from the early 19th century. It was dated as January 22nd, 1892. It told of a group of native Canadian nomads who had been caught in a winter storm and came to the church to seek shelter. The preacher had invited them inside without question and soon had a pot of warm food ready for them. The other residents of the town were less welcoming to the guests. That winter had been hard on the town, and the townsfolk felt that the preacher should have given the food to the town before their guests. The preacher not only refused, but took it further and fed the nomads' dogs, which had also been invited inside. The townspeople became enraged at this and proceeded to block the doors and set fire to the wooden structure. Apparently, the preacher had led all those inside out the back door. The nomads all escaped with their lives and they ran off into the storm. As they ran off, one of them was reported to have uttered a curse which would bring ruin unto the town, save for the preacher. The article ended there, but other scraps of paper mentioned the preacher locking himself in the basement of the ruined church with one of the dogs. Another was a written account of a conscientious objector who watched the town rebuild the church soon after, possibly with the preacher still in the basement. The general assumption was that the preacher took to a dark art form to bring a sense of righteous punishment to the town, but at the cost of his life and that of the dog. Whatever the case, apparently when the new church building was built, it trapped his punishment within its walls. I looked at one of the pictures of the burned-out church and saw something unusual. Among the piles of charred timber and ash, there was the church's altar, but this one looked uncannily similar to the one in the church now. No, it wasn't similar. It was the same altar. I looked to one of the pictures of the new church partway through the construction, and a gap in the wall, I could see the same altar. I stood up and went to the door. When I got outside, it was getting dark. I hadn't realized how long I had been there, but it didn't matter. I had to get back to the church. Soon after, I heard James and Sam coming after me. They tried to stop me from going back inside, but I brushed them off. I needed to be certain of something, and nobody was going to stop me. I reached the church and pushed open the doors. Without hesitating, I walked down the aisle. As I did, I started to notice scratch marks on the pews and the floor. The gas lamps were still lit as I reached the altar. I looked up at the statue of Jesus and uttered a short prayer, something I had never done before. I stepped up onto the platform and put both hands on the altar. I noticed Sam and James making their way towards me, albeit with caution. I had them join me on the stand and place their hands on the altar also. With a nod of my head, I indicated that we should push. We pushed for a moment before there was a scraping sound, and I felt a cold wind caress my ankles. I looked down and saw a small gap under the altar. We pushed again until the stone slid off the edge of the platform onto the floor below. A cold wind rushed past us, and all the gas lamps were blown out. Before me, I saw a staircase leading down into a dark hole. I paused for a moment and went to my room to find a lamp. I took the one off my desk and lit it. I was now prepared both mentally and physically to descend the staircase. The first thing I noticed was that it was cold in the basement, colder than it really should have been. It was enough to make me wish I had my coat, but if I went to get it, I wouldn't be able to force myself back down the hole. I pressed forward down the stairs, which had been meticulously cut into the solid rock of the Canadian Shield. Eventually, I reached a landing and the stairs flattened out into a hallway. At the end, I could see a doorway. It was coated in cobwebs, and I waved my hands back and forth in order to keep them out of my eyes and mouth. Upon reaching the door, I placed my hands on it to try and open it. The door was smooth to the touch. It was made of wood which had been lacquered. I pushed on the door until I heard a sound from behind me. A soft clicking sound accompanied by a sort of shallow, consistent breathing. I turned around hoping I would see nothing and could attribute it to my imagination. The monstrosity I saw before me was not a product of any sane person's imagination. It looked like a dog, save for the sickening red orbs which floated where its eyes should have been, casting long shadows around me. The thing stood 3 feet at the shoulder, or it should have. Instead of feet, the hound's legs ended in a wispy cloud of darkness coming from the beast itself. The cur peeled back its lips and started a low growl, and emitting breath which smelled as though someone had spilled sulfur and fresh blood over a new grave. It took a step towards me, with murderous intent visible in its crimson eyes. As it did, I pushed my back up against the door and felt it give way behind me. Stumbling backwards into the room, I caught myself and stayed on my feet. The door hung open. Evidently, it hadn't been locked, or after decades of continued disuse, the hinges had lost their strength. A quick glance around revealed that I was sitting in a study of sorts. It was in a state of disrepair, but the bookshelves were filled with works of writing, and the oak desk sat unoccupied. The terrorous mutt stood in the door, almost hesitant to enter. I used this moment to search for a weapon. I backed myself to the desk and felt around for something heavy. I clasped my hands around a book. Bringing it to my face, I could see that it was old and yellowed, with cracks in the leather cover. The title was written in letter that I couldn't make out. They must have faded too much. Taking the heavy leather-bound book in both hands, I hurled it towards the dog, and was lucky enough to have it strike it on the face. The beast shook and recoiled with the hit, but soon shook off whatever damage had been done and came at me once more. Again, I searched the desk for something to defend myself. This time I found an old letter opener. In the light of my lantern, it glinted with an almost blue shine. Wielding it in both hands like some kind of sword, I turned again to face the creature, and it seemed to shy away from it. For a moment, I felt a kind of power. I took a step forward, and to my surprise, the dog took a step back. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew that the dog was blocking my only exit. Soon the beast made a new noise. Gone was the growl. It was replaced with a whine. For a moment, the dog seemed like a helpless puppy trapped in its kennel. I suddenly realized that it was exactly that. This animal had been trapped here and it had died here. This animal was no longer living as a physical animal, but the fear and betrayal it felt when it had died continued to live on as the apparition before me. For the first time, I considered that this animal might be able to understand what I say, and so I spoke to it. I regarded him not as a monster or a terror, but a friend and equal with just as much right to be here as I had. The response was one of caution, as he perked up his ears and some of the rage left his eyes. He maintained the low stance of a dog about to attack and kept his eyes focused on my hands. Realizing that I had neglected to drop the letter opener, I did so. The dog sat up and walked towards me, just barely making eye contact before walking past me and sitting down by a door at the other end of the room. I moved to the door, glancing at the desk, which was full of scribbled notes with no clear meaning. I stepped around the chair, which had been knocked over some time ago. I paused when I reached the door and reached down to scratch the dog behind the ears. I pushed open the door and raised my lantern. I took a step into the room and immediately noticed that this room was different. My lantern lit most of the room from the moment I stepped inside. The dog was close to my heels, behind my legs. The dog had been here before. If he had reason to be afraid, so did I. Looking downward, I could see a dark stain where something had spilled a large amount of dark liquid. I knew it was blood. From the big stain, there were marks in it where something had been placed into the fresh puddle and dragged across the room. I followed the drag marks until they cornered. This was a deliberate change in direction. I took several steps back so I could see the entire room. The blood had been used to draw a complex and intricate shape on the floor. It was like someone had drawn a pattern within a circle. Off to the side of the room was a small pile of what looked like dried wood. Upon closer inspection, I found they were bones. I could tell that these bones belonged to the dog, who even now was staring up at me. Then, across the room, I saw something that made my skin crawl. Leaning against the wall in the farthest corner of the room was the skeleton of a person. I went in close to see it, hoping that I would not vomit when I did so. I stopped about 3 feet from it. I could see now that this person had died in great agony. The bones were charred and cracked, and all around it were scraps of burnt cloth. I knelt closer to the corpse and saw something at his chest. Melted into the ribs was the sole item which would allow me to identify this poor soul. A silver cross wedged into the space between two ribs told me that this man was the priest from the stories. His head was tilted back and his mouth open. It was as if this man had been screaming when he died. I thought back to the newspapers and the stories. When looking at the room, I could tell that the stories of dark arts and black magic had been true, that this man had tried to call something from another place to carry out his vengeance. It was clear that he had failed in his mission to avenge his church, but there was still something which concerned me. This man had been immolated when he died for certain. However, there was no evidence of this in the room. Nowhere was there an empty container which could have held oil, not even a shattered lamp. Furthermore, why would he set fire to himself anyway? He would be unable to enjoy his revenge. A dark and terrifying thought came into my head. Perhaps he had succeeded in calling forth a being of pure hatred for the purpose of revenge. But when it arrived and found the only sacrifice offered was a dog, it took the priest instead. I couldn't say why it wouldn't have carried out the priest's orders afterwards, but perhaps demons dislike being cheated. I chose not to dwell on the thought any further. Instead, I went back to the study and pulled out the biggest drawer and emptied it of its contents, mostly paper, some charcoal, and a single book. I picked up the book and read the title, Old Beliefs, the Spirits of the Indians. Out of curiosity, I opened it and noticed that one page was marked. This legend spoke of a being or pure flame who could act according to the one who summons it. On the page opposite was a picture of a complex emblem, not unlike the one drawn in blood in the other room. I closed the book and stuffed it in my pocket. I took the empty drawer to the other room and gently took the bones of the dog who had curiously disappeared and placed them into the drawer. I took it back up the stairs and into the church, where Sam and James were still waiting nervously for me. They were more surprised to see the drawer full of bones than they were to see me. I stated my intention to bury them off the church property, to which they questioned. I simply replied that they had been at the church long enough. I buried the bones deep in the woods where they wouldn't be found and returned to the church. I moved the altar back to where it should have been and sealed it with concrete. I consider this place my home now. I'm the only one who knows all its secrets, but I fear there are those who seek them also. Once since that evening, someone broke into my home and searched through my things. I was gone for the evening and had no idea what had transpired. It was only when the constable found me at the pub that I found out. It turned out that the only thing the thief had taken was the book from the basement. Apparently, the thief had gotten scared and ran out into the woods where he was discovered dead. The constable said he was covered in bite marks, probably from a wolf. I knew what had really happened to him. I had a friend who was always in the church to keep watch over my belongings. Later that week, I locked the book inside the record room with all the newspaper clippings. It would be safe there. I still locked the door at night, though. The dog was stuck inside, but there were still scratches outside the door. I don't know what did that, but I don't want it in the church.